Hello everyone, and welcome back to the channel. Today, we're diving into a topic that sparks intense debate all over the world: socialism. It's a word we hear a lot, often painted as a utopian dream or a dystopian nightmare. Proponents often talk about equality, justice, and a safety net for all. But what does the historical record actually show us when these ideas are put into practice on a national scale? Today, we're going to take a clear-eyed look at some of the most significant examples of socialist states in the 20th century and examine the outcomes. This isn't about theory, it's about real-world results and the human cost that often gets lost in the discussion. Let's start with what is perhaps the most famous and influential socialist experiment: the Soviet Union. Born from the Russian Revolution in 1917, the USSR aimed to create the world's first communist state, a society without classes, where the means of production were owned by the people. The core idea was central planning. The government, not the free market, would decide everything: what to produce, how much to produce, and what the price would be. On paper, it sounds efficient, a way to eliminate wasteful competition and ensure everyone gets what they need. But the reality was a far cry from the theory. The central planners in Moscow, no matter how intelligent, couldn't possibly have enough information to effectively manage the economy of a country that vast and complex. They didn't know what a farmer in Ukraine needed or what a factory worker in Siberia wanted. This lack of information and local knowledge led to massive inefficiencies. You'd have factories producing tons of left shoes but no right ones, or vast quantities of steel that nobody needed, while people were lining up for hours just to get a loaf of bread. These shortages weren't just an inconvenience, they were a chronic feature of life. The system simply couldn't adapt to people's needs. Without the price signals of a market economy, there was no way to tell what was in demand and what wasn't. The result was a stagnant economy that consistently failed to provide a decent standard of living for its citizens. While the West was experiencing a post-war boom with innovations in consumer goods, from televisions to washing machines, the average Soviet citizen was struggling with scarcity. The promise of material prosperity for the working class never materialized. Beyond the economic failures, the human cost was staggering. In order to collectivize agriculture in the 1930s, Joseph Stalin's regime waged a brutal war on the peasantry, particularly in Ukraine. Private farms were forcibly seized and consolidated into state-controlled collectives. Those who resisted, the so-called kulaks, were arrested, deported to gulags, or executed. This policy led directly to a catastrophic man-made famine, the Holodomor, where millions of Ukrainians starved to death. This wasn't a natural disaster. It was the direct consequence of a state seizing control of food production and using it as a weapon against its own people. The political system required to maintain this economic control was one of total repression. To enforce the central plan and crush any dissent, the Soviet Union became a one-party totalitarian state. There was no freedom of speech, no freedom of the press, and no political opposition allowed. The secret police, from the Cheka to the KGB, were an ever-present threat. Any hint of disagreement could lead to a knock on the door in the middle of the night, followed by imprisonment in the vast network of forced labor camps known as the Gulag, or worse. The state's quest for total economic control led inevitably to total political control, sacrificing individual liberty for the sake of the collective, a collective defined and controlled by a small, unaccountable elite. Now let's turn our attention to Asia and look at China under Mao Zedong. Following the communist victory in 1949, Mao embarked on his own radical socialist transformation. The most infamous of these was the Great Leap Forward, which began in 1958. The goal was to rapidly transform China from an agrarian society into an industrial powerhouse, supposedly leapfrogging the West in just a few years. Just like in the Soviet Union, agriculture was collectivized. Peasants were forced into massive communes, and private plots of land were forbidden. The plan was a chaotic disaster from the start. Untested agricultural techniques were imposed across the country. In one infamous campaign, Mao declared war on sparrows, believing they ate too much grain. The result was an ecological imbalance, leading to a massive increase in locusts and other pests that destroyed crops. At the same time, millions of farmers were pulled away from the fields and ordered to produce steel in backyard furnaces. Most of the steel they produced was completely useless, but the diversion of labor from farming was catastrophic. The result was the Great Chinese Famine, one of the deadliest famines in human history. From 1959 to 1962, it's estimated that tens of millions of people starved to death. Party officials, afraid to report bad news to Mao, falsified reports, claiming record harvests while people were dying in the countryside. The state continued to export grain to prove the success of the Great Leap Forward, even as its own citizens were starving. It's a chilling example of how a centrally planned system, combined with a totalitarian political structure, can be completely detached from human reality, with devastating consequences. A few years later, to reassert his authority, Mao launched the Cultural Revolution. It was a decade of political violence and social chaos. Young people, organized into the Red Guards, were encouraged to attack the four olds: old customs, old culture, old habits, and old ideas. Teachers were humiliated, temples were destroyed, and intellectuals were persecuted. The goal was to purge society of all bourgeois and traditional elements, creating a purely revolutionary culture. But what it really did was tear the fabric of Chinese society apart, destroying families, erasing priceless cultural heritage, and plunging the nation into a decade of terror and paranoia. It wasn't until after Mao's death and the economic reforms initiated by Deng Xiaoping, which reintroduced market principles, that China began to lift hundreds of millions of people out of poverty. Let's look at another example, smaller in scale but just as tragic: Cambodia under the Khmer Rouge. From 1975 to 1979, Pol Pot and his followers attempted to create the most radical agrarian socialist society the world had ever seen. Their goal was to instantly reset the country to year zero, completely eliminating all foreign influence, city life, and modern institutions. Immediately after taking power, they forcibly emptied the cities. The entire population of Phnom Penh, millions of people, were marched into the countryside to work as slaves in collective farms. Money, markets, and private property were abolished overnight. Religion was banned. Family structures were dismantled, with children separated from their parents and indoctrinated by the state. The regime considered anyone with an education, doctors, teachers, engineers, even people who wore glasses, to be an enemy of the revolution. They were systematically rounded up and executed. In just 4 years, the Khmer Rouge regime was responsible for the deaths of an estimated 1.5 to 2 million people, which was nearly a quarter of the country's entire population. This wasn't just economic mismanagement. It was a deliberate, ideologically driven genocide. The Cambodian killing fields stand as a horrifying monument to what can happen when a regime gains absolute power in the name of creating a perfect, equal society. The pursuit of a utopian ideal led to an almost unimaginable hell on earth. So, what's the common thread here? In the Soviet Union, China, and Cambodia, we see a recurring pattern. The implementation of socialism involved the state concentrating immense economic and political power into its own hands. First, the abolition of private property and free markets. This destroyed the mechanisms that efficiently allocate resources and respond to human needs. The result was not prosperity, but chronic shortages, economic stagnation, and, in the worst cases, catastrophic famine. Second, to enforce this radical economic transformation, individual liberty had to be extinguished. One-party rule, the suppression of dissent, state terror, and the cult of personality became the necessary tools to maintain control. The state, which was supposed to wither away, according to Marxist theory, instead became an all-powerful, totalitarian monster. Third, the human cost was immense. Whether through deliberate terror, politically engineered famines, or the slow grind of life in a repressive society, these regimes were responsible for the deaths of tens of millions of people and the suffering of countless more. The dream of a classless, egalitarian society became a nightmare of oppression, poverty, and death. Of course, supporters of socialism today might argue that these weren't true socialism. They might say that Stalin, Mao, and Pol Pot were corrupt dictators who twisted a noble idea. Or they might point to more moderate social democratic models in places like Scandinavia. But it's important to distinguish between social democracies, which are fundamentally market-based economies with strong social safety nets, and the socialist states that explicitly sought to abolish capitalism. The historical record of the 20th century is clear. Every time a state has attempted to abolish private property and centralize complete control of the economy in the name of socialism, the result has been economic failure and political tyranny. The promise of utopia has consistently delivered the opposite. It's a crucial lesson from history, one that we should remember as we continue to debate the best way to organize our societies for the future. Thank you so much for watching. This is a heavy topic, and there's so much more we could discuss. What are your thoughts? Let me know in the comments below. If you found this video informative, please give it a thumbs up and subscribe for more deep dives into important historical topics. See you next time.